This is Dan Schneider. On this Dan Schneider video interview, I'm kicking off the first what I hope will be a number of shows on the tribes and nations of Native America, hopefully talking with people who are with the tribes, know about the different nations, their scientific background, their cultural history, and so forth. And the first group that I am going to be speaking about are the Unangas, or the Aleutian Islanders, for people outside of that group. And the conversation will begin in a moment. The topic is Aleutian Islanders, or the Unangas in their own tongue. I am speaking with a woman named Deborah Corbett. She is an expert on their history and their background, and we will be talking about a lot of things. But before we talk about that, I want to give her a couple of minutes, as I always do to my guests, give a little bit of background about herself. So welcome, Deborah, as you are the first kicking off this series. And if you could give me a little bit of background about who you are and what drew you to study the Nungan people.
Well, I'm an archaeologist. I'm a kind of classically trained archaeologist at the University of Arizona. Archaeology is a branch of anthropology. There are four branches, archaeology being probably the best known, physical anthropology, linguistics, and cultural anthropology. After I graduated in 1980, I kind of wandered around working various places, and in 83 got a job in Alaska working for the Bureau of Indian Affairs, examining land claims by the native corporations. And at that time, the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act had passed, and the native corporations, native groups were divided into 13 regional corporations broadly based on ethnicity, language groups, etc. And those corporations were allotted lands. So they were claiming their lands around the state. Every corporation is made up of villages, which were also corporations, and the villages got land claims. One tiny paragraph in the Land Claims Act allowed the regional corporations to claim historic and cemetery sites that were important to the people in that region. And that was what I was hired to be on a team investigating these historic and cemetery sites. And we were supposed to locate the sites. We were given lists, locate the sites, determine their historic importance, and verify their existence. And that was in 1983. And I ended up, because I'd been on a boat once or twice, I ended up in the Aleutian Islands. But I actually, in high school, had read a book by Hector Chavigny called Russian America. And he, in one of his descriptions of the Aleutian Islands, stuck with me. It just grabbed me and stuck. And I wanted to see the Aleutians. So when I was actually selected to go, I was very excited to finally be able to get to the Aleutian Islands. And they flew us out to Adak, which is right about in the middle of the chain. We were in two crews, I think 7 people on each crew. We stayed in nasty little shacks on the west side of the island. We were dropped off out there by a naval vessel, given a rubber Zodiac and I believe a 30 horsepower motor, a radio for contact, and with a smile and a wave, we were left on the west coast of Adak to look for archaeological sites that the Aleut Corporation had claimed. And it was probably the best summer of my life. It was an extraordinary experience. I was in the Bay of Islands, which is on the west side of Adak. It it's a kind of a magical name. The other team was on a spit of land between Three Arm Bay and the Bay of Waterfalls. So again, magical locations, and interesting people. And then we just immersed ourselves in Aleutian archaeology. We knew nothing. No one on any of the crews knew anything about the Aleutians. I don't believe anyone had even been there before. So we were inventing it as we went. We'd been hired from the lower 48, told where we were going 2 weeks before we left, and our charge was to find these sites and evaluate their importance. So it was kind of being thrown in the deep end of a world that none of us knew existed. And I worked with the Bureau of Indian Affairs until 1990, most of that time working in the Aleutians. And at that point, I went to grad school in Fairbanks to be an Aleutian archaeologist. And then I came back in 91, I believe, went to work for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, which manages the Aleutians as part of the Alaska Maritime National Wildlife Refuge. So that first summer in 1983, I developed an obsession that kind of guided my career until now, still.
So I'll ask you a little bit about your career as we go along, and we'll start sort of going chronologically, historically. But I do want to say something since I'm starting this new series, and I want you to reiterate something that you had mentioned to me in the emails. And people might be wondering, well, Dan, everyone knows that, you're as white as they come. I'm half Norwegian, a quarter Russian, quarter German. And here you are interviewing a white woman, obviously, about these other people. So people might say, well, why aren't you doing it? Well, I just want to put on the record, I started with contacting about three nations tribes, two in the East Coast, the Oneida and the Mohawks, and I didn't get anywhere with that. And then I sent to probably a total of 25, 30 emails to individuals, to corporations, to try to speak to someone who's a tribal leader, someone who might be a linguist or an ethnologist that is with the people, but I have had no success. And this is a replication of a lot of issues that I've had over the years with interviews. For example, it's hard to get, for example, a lot of African American people to speak on things outside of African American issues. Similarly, too, I've always had problems getting a representative amount of females to speak on certain issues. If I'm doing, say, a show on film noir, it's hard to get a lot of women who are film critics who love film noir. So I had asked you, in an email, why is it so difficult to get some of the native people to want to speak about it? Was it that I'm an outsider, they didn't want to speak to me? Was I just have a little YouTube channel, I'm not ABC News or something? And if you could just reiterate what you had told me in the email.
Well, part of it is they're suspicious of outsiders. And I would say, I don't want to speak for the Aleut people. I can't. But from my experience, they've been portrayed badly as the other, as just somehow very different. So they're suspicious until they develop a relationship, until they've seen someone in action, and they build a level of trust. And so that's part of it. Another part is that the corporations are for-profit entities. Their job is to make money. So they're not really focused on cultural heritage. A few of them have branched into that and done some cultural heritage work, but they don't have staff that really knows. The village corporations and the tribes, they're two very different things. A village corporation is a for-profit entity. The tribe is a governmental entity. In Alaska, the tribes are in the villages. They're based in the villages. They're not big groups, like in the lower 48 on a reservation, there's a tribe with a tribal government. A tribal government here may represent 400 people, 500 people, and they just don't have the resources or the energy to leap into something without knowing who they're getting in touch with. Usually there's one or two people in a village that are pretty much kind of running things. I mean, most people are raising their kids, they're working, they're trying to get work, they're getting food, they're living, they're doing their thing, and layering on the bureaucratic work of getting grants to keep services functioning, educational programs going. There's usually one or two people doing that, and they're stretched pretty thin. Yeah. And so without an introduction from someone they know, or without a deep personal interest on the part of a tribal or a village representative, you're probably not going to get a lot of feedback, just because they don't have the time, really. A lot of it just comes down to, we just don't have the time. And I mentioned a friend who is an administrator in one small village. I think they have less than 100 people in that village, and she is the mayor of the town. So it's a town under Alaska law. It's a village corporation under the Land Claims Act, and it is a tribal entity. And I don't know that she has an official position with the tribe, but she's the mayor of the community and the head of the corporation, and she also works as an administrator for the tribe. So she's kind of a one-man band. And she has, I believe, 3 children, and one of them was born this summer. So, she's not likely to reach out and take on another project.
Yeah. It was interesting to me too, because I did contact some people who had written books about Aleutian, Unangan culture, and they were, I guess, by the names, seemed to be mostly white. And when I contacted them, they said, well, they didn't want to talk about it. And I just found it odd too that you'll write a book about this subject, but you don't want to actually talk about it. But that aside, I do want to let's start with modern day, the last couple of years, the age of COVID, before we go back. How have Aleutians and Unangans, how have the Inuit people and other northern native tribes done vis-a-vis the tribes from the lower 48? Because I spoke with a fellow named Mark Charles, who ran for president on an independent run last year, and I was actually going to vote for him for president. And he was, was he a Navajo? He's a Navajo or Pueblo, and he was telling me about the much higher rates of alcoholism, the higher rates of COVID that have hit the reservations. Here in the lower 48, there's a controversy about why, whenever a white woman goes missing, does she make a media sensation, whereas many Native American women have disappeared in the last decade or so. Are the Aleutians, the Inuits, and other northern tribes in Alaska, do they have it somewhat better or about the same, would you say?
It's a challenge living in rural Alaska. They face all the challenges that people live in small rural communities anywhere in the U.S. have, but they are plagued with high rates of alcoholism, high rates of suicide. And this isn't a blanket across the state. Some areas really have high rates, others less. But alcoholism, suicide, kids dropping out of school, you can make more money fishing, over a short term, and it's hard to keep kids in school when they know they're going to be a fisherman. Healthcare is poor in the villages. There are lots of domestic abuse. Just a lot a lot of dysfunction, and I don't like pointing out that it's not a native problem. I think it's a common problem in rural communities everywhere.
And
But
poverty too.
poverty, there are very few jobs. The Aleutians are more favored than some areas because the fishing industry. A lot of these people work in the fishing industry, and they can make a damn fine living as fishermen. There are challenges with that now with climate change and changes in the size of salmon runs, or this year, one of the crab fisheries is virtually closed down because the population of crabs is 90% dropped, 90% over last year. Where are the crabs? So the fishing is seriously curtailed. They're challenged by finding work, meaningful work, that is, culturally relevant, and maintaining small communities that are very hard to get to. The one village I was talking about is 100 people in the middle of a tiny island in the middle of the North Pacific, and getting the supplies and the goods and services you need in a village like that is an ongoing problem. Getting to Anchorage to get your teeth fixed costs several $1,000s before you even get to town. So the challenges in rural communities in Alaska, I think, are paralleled in the lower 48, but exaggerated by remoteness and expense. I believe when COVID hit, rural communities in Alaska were very proactive. They have grandparents or great-grandparents who were affected by the 1918 flu epidemic. We lost whole villages in 1918. And they immediately closed down access to a lot of villages, closed down access, no one in or out, until vaccines were available. And the Native Health Service, I think, did an extraordinary job getting vaccines to rural communities here. And the hotspots in Alaska for COVID infections are predominantly white communities, near Fairbanks, north of Anchorage, and on the Kenai Peninsula, where we have a lot of people who are vaccine deniers or COVID deniers. Native people were not. They understood all too well the threat this posed to their communities and their people.
What is the current outlook for the next 10 or 20 years with global warming? I mean, how hot? I mean, I know the Aleutians are rocky outcroppings. That it's not like some of the tropical islands, which are basically just glorified sandbars. Are they safer than from global warming than some of those more southerly islands, in the tropics?
I think physically they probably are, but economically, with the shifts in the fisheries, they're facing economic uncertainty more than the usual economic uncertainty.
And with like whaling and fishing, I know that certain cultures, especially in the Arctic, whether it's the Sami up in Scandinavia, whether it's in Siberian natives, they sometimes get exemptions for hunting whales or whatnot. How dependent are these communities upon those industries that sort of conflict with the idea of Green New Deals and whatnot? Because a lot of people in the lower 48, they don't. We're not cool here in the U.S. on whaling, unlike, say, Japan. So is there a tension between that, those two forces?
Not really. Alaskan natives are allowed to hunt sea mammals, which white people can't hunt: seals, sea lions, walrus, sea otters, whales. they're allowed to hunt those because of traditional uses. There is active whaling in Alaska and North Alaska. The Inupiat people actively hunt whales. There's a spring hunt and a fall hunt. There's I can't remember what it's called, an Eskimo Whaling Commission
Mm-hmm.
that works with National Marine Fisheries that manages whales, and they set catch limits and they set the rules for the hunt. It's actually reported in the news when a village catches a whale. The local news will report that such and such a village captured a whale. The Barrow whaling captains brought in 2 whales. And it's a matter of celebration. People go up and visit these communities when a whale is brought in because there's feasting and celebrations, and it's just generally a good time. Everybody's happy, and lots of people gathering and stuff. So in Alaska, it's generally that's just the way people work and live, and it's important to get it's important for economics, just something to eat during the winter, but it's also important culturally. So no, we don't have Alaskans don't generally have a conflict with Native people hunting traditionally. We have a rural preference for hunting things like moose and caribou. It's not ethnically based. It's a federal rural preference. The Land Claims Act gave Alaska Natives, gave rural Alaskans priority rights to hunt and fish. That's based on where they live and their rural status, because federal law can't be racially based. And there is a conflict there with state law, which says that all Alaskans share in the resources of Alaska. So there is a conflict there, but it's more of two bureaucracies figuring out how to work together more than a conflict over Native people shouldn't have rights to catch moose or caribou to feed their families.
Now, since the international date line zigzags through the Bering Sea, are there some Unangan people that have dual citizenship between Russia and the U.S., or are some of them split? One family lives on one island, and the other one's American, one's Russian.
The Russians moved Unangan people from the Aleutian Islands to the Commander Islands, which, if you look at the Aleutian chain, it's a long arc, and there are 2 islands on the Russian side that are the Commander Islands, and there's quite a gap from Attu to the Commander Islands. They were uninhabited before the Russians showed up. We're not sure if people from either Siberia, Kamchatka, or the Aleutians had visited them. There hasn't been enough work done there. But the Russians moved people to the Commander Islands to hunt the fur seals, and to hunt otters there, and to resupply ships, et cetera, et cetera. So there are Unangan families there, but the separation was long enough ago that there aren't direct family members. Okay. There is a group, I think it's called Aleut International, that works to maintain ties of friendship and culture between the Commander Island Unangan and the Aleutian Island people.
So you had mentioned a lot of these villages are corporations, and certainly in the southern 48, a lot of native tribes do make money from gambling and casinos. Are there similar things in the Aleutians or not?
No. There have been a few tribes trying to get gambling and casinos, but we don't have reservations. We don't have Indian. We have one Indian reservation in Southeast Alaska, right on the very southern end of the Panhandle. There's one Indian reservation, Metlakatla. So the tribes, the governmental entities, don't have the land base, and the legal framework doesn't exist here for tribal gaming, because I believe most of the casinos in the lower 48 are actually on reservations. And since we don't have those here, they don't own sovereign territory that is not subject to state management.
Now, you talked about some are able to make good incomes in the fishing industry. With these villages, do most of the Nungan people do they get like a share of the corporation of their village, and for profits from tourism or anything like that? And I know, for example, that Alaska itself gives dividends from oil revenue to all of its citizens. Do they partake in that? And finally, the last presidential election, the topic of universal basic income came in. Is the Alaskan oil distribution of profits, is that similar to UBI?
I believe it is. The permanent fund was set up when the oil started flowing down the
Pipeline.
Trans-Alaska Pipeline, and our politicians at the time were probably a lot brighter than the ones we have now, realized if they didn't put a savings account aside, they would spend that money as like drunk sailors. So they set aside a permanent fund, the idea being that this fund would build up, and then as the oil supply dwindled, which it is, the earnings from the permanent fund could be used to fund state government. As a protective measure, because as you know, if there's a big pot of money sitting over here and the politicians need money, they're going to go for it.
Yeah.
So what they did was they set up a permanent fund payout every year. They split up a small percentage of the earnings, interest earnings for that fund, and they distribute it to Alaskans. I believe the first one was $300, and it's gone up. Now it's closer to $1,200-$1,500 a year for every man, woman, and child who's a legal resident of the state of Alaska. And that is a huge injection of funds into the Alaskan economy every year. It's actually, the money starts going out in October. So the timing is really interesting. And what has happened is there's a huge conference called the Alaska Federation of Natives. Every year there's a huge conference. They bring people from all over the state, thousands of people from all over the state, into Anchorage or Fairbanks for a week or 10 days of conferences, socializing, and people come into Anchorage that during this conference. They go to the doctor, they meet with relatives, they take care of they get their city fix during the AFN convention. They also stock up for the winter. So no one who lives in Anchorage or Fairbanks will go near a Costco or, the big box stores or a major retailer during the AFN convention, because there are literally hundreds, if not thousands, of rural Alaskans flooding into these stores, buying things and having them sent out to the villages this time of year. So I understand that Alaska has far less income inequality than a lot of states, because this permanent fund is like the ground floor.
Yeah. And do the individual village corporations bring in any revenue that's split amongst the people?
I'm not sure. Most of the village corporations are pretty shoestring operations. They're pretty not a lot of cash flow. Some of the regional corporations make a lot of money, and they do distribution share. It's the dividends from the shareholders. Some of them, the one based in Anchorage around Cook Inlet, they have a lot of property in the city. They have businesses. A lot of the corporations actually have like oil field services and things like that. So yeah, the corporations are bringing money into the communities and distributing that to their shareholders.
Okay, so before I just have a few more questions just to set this up before we dig deeply into history. With global warming, polar bears, there's less ice and whatnot. Did there used to be polar bears as far south as the Aleutian Islands? And have they receded now? Are they still on the Pribilof Islands?
I believe they would occasionally show up in the Pribilofs, where they're not welcome. There was a resident population of polar bears on an uninhabited island called St. Matthew, which is St. Lawrence Island is right about in the middle of Bering Strait, and the Pribilofs are down much closer to the Aleutians, and St. Matthew's kind of in the middle. There was a resident population there that got hunted out in the 1800s. So when they get as far south as the Aleutians, it's really an anomaly.
Yeah, okay. And the Pribilofs, were they originally inhabited by Aleut people or Unangas, or was that only after the white people came?
The Russians also moved people to the Pribilofs. The Commander Islands and the Pribilofs host the fur seal breeding fur seals every year. 80% of them are in the Pribilofs. So the Russians took people to the Pribilofs to harvest seals and process the furs. And so they set up communities on both St. Paul and St. George, and they are now long established, probably from the mid 1800s on, communities out there. But they were known to the Unangan before the Russians arrived, but they didn't actually live there.
And we've used the terms interchangeably: Aleut, Aleut, Unangan, Unangas. What's the preferred pronunciation of is it Aleut or Aleut? And do the natives prefer to be called Unangans rather than Aleutians?
It's changing. I think the older ones are fine with Aleut. Younger ones they're trying to reclaim an identity, and the word Aleut, which I believe was the self-designation of the people from the near islands, Attu, Agatu, Shemya, I believe that they called themselves Aleut. Prior to the Russians, there wasn't a national term for the people we've lumped as Aleuts. The closest is Unangan, Unangas, Unanga. But that's not totally satisfactory, but for a number of reasons. But the word Aleut was applied to all the people in the Aleutian Islands. Then it became applied to the people on the Alaska Peninsula, who are very different different culturally, but very different linguistically. They're more closely related to Yupik Eskimos. Became applied to the people in Kodiak, who were traditional enemies of the Aleutian Islanders. Became applied to people in Bristol Bay. So basically the word Aleut came to mean anybody who had achieved a certain status under Russian rule. They were Orthodox. They were incorporated into the Russian economic system, And the modern Aleutian Islanders want to reclaim an identity that is separate from all of that lumped Aleut group.
And so the Aleutians or the Unangas, they are the people that are basically within the Bering Strait. That peninsula that sticks out from the southwestern portion of Alaska. That's Kenai or Katmai.
Katmai is at the north end.
Okay.
The Aleut, Unangan Aleut, extended east and north up the peninsula a short way. There were at the very northern end were Yupik Eskimos, related to people from Southwest Alaska, and then in the middle they are Alutiiq, Sugpiaq or Alutiiq people, who are more closely related to the people from Kodiak. So it's really a kind of a crossroads and a mixing zone, cultural mixing zone.
Okay.
That peninsula.
So now that we've set the stage, Deborah, of sort of a brief glimpse of the modern life of the Nungan people, let's go back, I don't know, is it 10, 20, 30,000 years ago? Because I know that the earliest supposed crossing from Asia across Beringia into America of what later became Native American people it has sometimes been put back as far as 30,000 years. But I know that certainly the Inuits, and I think they were preceded by Dorset peoples, and the Aleutians, they came later, and you can tell that they have more what would be considered classically East Asian features than, say, tribes down in the Amazon. So when did they the Unangans first to come over, and were they before the Inuits or after generally?
My friend Diane Hansen, who's professor at University of Alaska Anchorage, and I talked me into writing a book about the prehistory of the Aleutian region. She did most of the work on this deeper history. So I reviewed her chapter yesterday. We're trying to wrap this thing up so we can move on to other things. The oldest evidence we have of people in Alaska is about 15,000 years. And the reason for that is probably because sea levels have risen and the coastal areas where people were living are flooded, and we just don't see it. The first people here were terrestrial hunters, going after big game. I don't think we have direct evidence that they hunted mammoths, but they were after the bison. They were after the big game in Beringia. These earliest people came down the Alaska Peninsula after the big game and ended up in the eastern Aleutian Islands that were attached to the mainland because of the lower sea levels. They were still big game hunters, land hunters. Down this far south, they were probably mostly caribou and moose, but nobody would have walked past seals and sea lions and walrus lounging on the beach without stopping to hunt those things. So as they moved down the peninsula, they came into a more marine environment, and the economy started to focus on these, what another friend calls large bags of fat, laying on a beach. I mean, you look at a seal and it's basically a sausage in a skin. And they would have not been worried about people. They would have, it's fairly easy to walk up to these things on a beach. So they started focusing more on the sea mammals. The earliest evidence we have for people in the Aleutians is about 9,000 to 10,000 years. And they were probably at that point hunting, they were sea mammal hunters. We don't have bones from these earliest sites. They're too old. Little tiny fragments that are very hard to identify. But because of where the sites are, they were almost certainly sea mammal hunters. They almost certainly had to have boats to get around, even though when they first got into the area, it may have been attached to the mainland. But they very early were developing this marine adaptation. The earliest people had a microblade technology. And it's a particular way to flake stone where you make a core, you shape a core of your stone. It's kind of a round, not very thick disc. And then you start knocking off these microblades, and they're really long, thin splinters of very, very sharp rock. And it's a distinct technology that showed up very early. These early microblade people, we don't know what language they spoke, we don't know what their ethnicity was, we don't know what they called themselves. It's called the Denali Complex in Alaska, and it spread through all of Alaska, out into the eastern Aleutians, and down the Pacific coast of Canada, almost to the U.S. border in Canada. And it almost mirrors the modern distribution of Athabascan Indians in Alaska. They belong to a language family we call Na-Dene, and they're ethnically, genetically, and culturally different than Native Americans in the lower 48 and even South America. The Na-Dene people are slightly different and were maybe a slightly later migration than the people who became the Indians of the lower 48. Their modern descendants are mostly Athabascan people in Alaska. Navajos in Arizona are Athabascans. Apaches are Athabascans. So some of them continued to move south. People on the northwest coast, like the Haida and Queen Charlotte Islands, speak a language that's also Na-Dene. So some of the people on the Pacific coast of Southeast Alaska and Canada were members of this very early 15,000 year, 20,000 year migration with this microblade technology. And those were at least one of the roots of the Aleutian people is that Na-Dene substrate.
Now, when you talk about these microblades, we're talking like arrowheads, down in the southern U.S. What is there's the people that had the famous
the Clovis points.
The Clovis points, yes.
These things are a microblade is they can actually be fairly large, but say it's 2 inches long and just half an inch wide, and smaller. They get smaller. And what they did, they knocked these things off. Then they could embed those sharp splinters into the side of a bone harpoon. So it provided the cutting edge for a bone tool or a wooden handle. It wasn't a point, but it was the sharp cutting edge of a bone tool.
Yeah. So 9,000 to 10,000 years ago, this would have been after the retreat of the glaciers, and I guess the coastlines would have been maybe a big. What do we think that the Siberia and Alaska were connected at that point? Did most of the ancestors walk across, or were they a seafaring culture already? Did they come from Kamchatka or where?
There are apparently several migrations into the New World from a few spots in Siberia.
Yeah.
I believe, I'm not sure where the Na-Dene people came from. I think most of it is believed to come from around Lake Baikal in Siberia. They probably mostly walked. They didn't have probably sophisticated boating technology, but they almost certainly had something that could be used to ferry people across rivers, across a bay, around a glacier. You know, probably something like the skin boats, the umiak style skin boats. But they weren't a maritime adapted people. They weren't specialists on maritime resources. They were fishing, they were hunting, they were gathering in coastal areas.
Do we know anything about the language subset? Do we know if they came from? You said probably like Baikal, but that's actually closer to the Mongolia than it is to like the Bering Sea. So if these were Inuit people, does their language show lineage back to that area? No.
No, there are people in Chukotka who speak the Siberian Yupik, which is related to the Yupik Eskimo in Southwest Alaska, but nothing deeper, nothing farther west. Recently, and I want to say by recent, probably within the last 10 or 15 years, linguists have identified a connection between the Nodine languages that are spoken mostly in Alaska and a nearly extinct family, tiny group of languages in Siberia. And I can actually send you the reference to that. This linguistic connection is very old, very deep, and was only recently discovered because of the opening of Russia to Western scholarship and more exchange of ideas. So yeah, there is a connection with the Nodine languages and a group of languages in Russia, in Siberia, that probably was much larger in the past and has just dwindled away over the thousands of years.
When Beringia was above water, I know obviously humanity radiated out from Africa, and the Americas were probably amongst the last places, along with maybe Australia and New Zealand, to get human habitation. But I know with the Inuits and I guess this Dorset culture which preceded it, they may have, I guess, did they come over the ice caps, just directly from Russia? And has there ever been any west to east migration of peoples? And
yeah, they're actually the way I'm interpreting the evidence we have is that there was probably a series of old migrations across. People are just, and they're not sitting on the edge going, we need to go south. We need to migrate south. They're looking for game. They're looking for. I've said in a monograph we wrote about our work on Shemya that happy people don't usually leave home. Happy people don't move to a new area. So people who are dissatisfied with their life or got in trouble at home and have to move on, or restless or looking for something, they're people who are dissatisfied with the way things are, and they're looking for something else. They're moving. People are constantly on the move, and that they gradually trickled into the New World. Then at some point we get this Nodine group trickling into the New World. And then we get people who become the ancestors of the Inuit and Inupiat trickling in to the New World. And of course, they're always, when they meet up with each other, they're either spearing each other or they're making babies with each other. So there's a constant mingling and change and mixing. So we have this very old substrate of people who became Indians in the lower, North and South American Indians. Then we get these Nodine people in, and they are adapted to this subarctic environment. It's harsh. I think it's one of the toughest environments on the planet to adapt to because it's very cold, very few resources. If your caribou migration doesn't come through, you don't really have a whole lot to fall back on. Yeah. But these are the people who spent the most time in Alaska, and I think they were among the ancestors of people who became Aleut. And a linguist, whose name I don't remember, a linguist has identified a Nodine substrate in the Unangan language. It's not a Nodine language, but there are hints in the deep, deep past that this Nodine was part of what became Aleut.
So let's let's move forward in time and talk about how myths and religions may have developed among the peoples of Alaska, especially the Unangans. I know that famously on Wrangel Island on the Russian side, actually in the Arctic Ocean, there were dwarf mammoths up till about 4,500 years ago. Do we have any evidence that there were any mammoths in the Pribilofs or the Aleutians? What has that? Did they form the basis of any myths in the Unangan culture?
Not that I know of. There are mammoths. There were mammoths on the Pribilof Islands, and I don't know if they last as long as the ones on Wrangel, but maybe as old as 1,000 years. Huh. I would have to check on that, but okay. Again, fairly recently, there's been a real explosion of scholarship in like the last 20 years, and all this new stuff has been found. But yes, there were mammoths in the Pribilofs. None, as far as we know, in the Aleutians at all. But they are found scattered across Alaska, and the Yupik people, I'm aware of myths among them of huge animals that move underground, and if they do break through the surface, they die, and that's what we find. The bones, the tusks, and the skulls are the remains of those giant animals that live underground, inadvertently breaking through.
So a couple of years ago, I had read something interesting. I actually mentioned this on my previous show when I was talking to a fellow about war, and that was that one of the interesting things about bears that came to the New World, and this I saw this article after watching a YouTube video about tigers battling Ussuri bears in Siberia, and they have these sort of idiotic videos. Well, what would happen if a polar bear took on a tiger? What would happen if this, that, and the other thing? And one of the interesting things, they talked about the migration of grizzly bears or brown bears from Russia over to Beringia, over Beringia into America, and how, for example, polar bears are scared shitless, apparently, of grizzly bears, even though grizzly bears are only 2/3 their size. But that's because they said that grizzly bears had to get more ferocious coming across Beringia, but on the American side were what they call short-faced bears, which were a lot bigger. And until they died out after the glaciation ended, the grizzlies couldn't get a hold in the New World. So the grizzlies, each 3 or 4 times that they tried over a 20,000-year period, were repelled by the short-faced bears. And I'm just wondering, because you mentioned that, certainly there was war between tribes, ancient tribes, even up there. was that a very hostile environment? I mean, I would think that over the course of 10,000 years, all these different peoples coming across, that if you're bottlenecked like that, basically,
Mhm.
you have to get by other peoples to get to where you want to go. What was the ancient culture like? Was it a warlike culture? Were these northern Spartans, say?
They they were people who were trained from birth to kill things for a living.
Mhm.
And they were trained to kill things that were bigger, meaner. A lot of native people, a lot of native belief is that all of these animals are self-aware. They have the same level of awareness that human beings do. They have motivation, they have volition, and native people very often believe that the animals are stronger, smarter, more clever than human beings. So, yeah, the world was an extraordinarily dangerous place. And it wasn't just the animals that are out there. Ernest Birch wrote an article called The Non-Empirical Environment of the Arctic Alaskan Eskimo. And he called the beings non-empirical because not everyone can see. Everyone can see a raven. Everyone can see a brown bear. Not everyone will see a cannibal baby.
Mm-hmm.
Not everyone will see the giant grayling in the lake that potentially can destroy your canoe and kill you. But they're as real as the grizzly bear and the caribou. So in addition to the very real, very dangerous empirical fauna out there, you had this very active non-empirical environment that very definitely affected human actions and decision making. So, and then of course there's the human beings that are also probably more unpredictable and frightening than any of the animals that are out there. If these are kin-based groups, if you run into a group of people that you're not familiar with and you can't establish some kind of a personal relationship, a lot of times when you're visiting people in a village, when I worked for the BIA, we always had interpreters. Among the first things that happened were the people we were talking to would be talking to our interpreter to find out who their family was, where their family was from, and they would work at it until they found a common connection. Oh, I know your great grandmother. Mm-hmm. Then it was okay. Then it's not hostile. So if you're a small group of people and you're moving through an area, you're trying to make connections with other people in the area. And if you can't, then the only option is hostile interactions.
What were the religion like? Was it animistic? Was it polytheistic? Was it monotheistic? Or were there multiple religions around the whole Bering area?
I've been doing a little research on the folklore and the religion, and there are some commonalities across the north, across the whole circumpolar north, some very basic fundamental similarities. And then there are, as you get down to different groups, they get more specific. But generally, everything has a soul, everything has volition and intelligence, and Well, I was telling my husband the other day, animals cannot act immorally. Animals are incapable of being immoral. Our interactions with the animals require us to become more moral than a human being might normally be. And the idea is, because those animals are intelligent and have volition, they offer themselves to a hunter. If the animal didn't want to be caught, it wouldn't be caught, and humans would die. So humans have an obligation to the animals they hunt to treat them respectfully and to treat them properly in a way that maintains the relationships between humans and animals, that keeps the world on an even track. The animals are managed or overseen by powerful spiritual beings. With the Aleutian people, there's a story of a girl who's in her menstrual seclusion, and she's visited at night by a man, which breaks every taboo in the book. And she decides she's going to find out who this guy is. And there are several versions of the story. In one, she marks his forehead with mud. In one, she tears his parka. In another one, she hamstrings him. And then in the daytime, she can find out who her secret admirer is. It's her brother. So she runs to the ocean and leaps off a cliff, and he follows her and leaps off a cliff, and they become sea otters. Now, the two sea otters, and I don't know how the transition happens. The boy, the man, becomes the moon, and the woman becomes the sun. The moon releases animal souls to be reborn on Earth, and then a seal that's killed, if it's handled properly, its soul can be reborn and become another seal. If it's not handled properly, it dies and goes away. So the hunter is responsible for making sure that seal is handled properly so that it will come back. The man in the moon is the one that decides if that seal can be reborn. So he's the deity that allows the reincarnation. If those animals aren't being treated properly, or if humans are otherwise acting immorally, the sun and the moon will withhold the animals and people will die. So the whole religious experience it's not worshiping deities. It's a system of relationships between animals, the non-empirical beings that inhabit the world, and different human groups. So it's a big juggling act.
Yeah. So there isn't one central deity then. It's sort of like and in reincarnation, a human being can't become an animal, and an animal can't become a human being. They just are constantly recycled.
Yeah, there's constantly recycled if they're treated properly. Yeah. If they're not, they can become dangerous. So they can become monsters that will attack human beings. A disrespectful hunter. Or there's another story where a man who had he couldn't catch anything. He was a terrible hunter, never caught anything, and an octopus approached him and said, I can fix your problem. So the octopus cleaned him out, and said, all I ask in return is that you give me the white heads of any sea otters that you catch. So they have, grizzled faces, they kind of blonde beards and things like that. So every time, the man was an incredible hunter after that, and every time he caught a sea otter with a white face, he would give the head to the octopus. I guess, thrown into the ocean and the octopus would get it. Well, one day he got careless and he quit. And the octopus destroyed his village.
Huh.
Just, I mean, flipped it upside down, totally wiped out the whole village for the transgression of the one man. So the animals force human beings to act in ways that are moral, that maintain, and morality maintains the equilibrium of the universe.
So let me just ask then a few classic myths around the world that seem to be appear in many cultures, and if there are any equivalents. The first one, given Beringia and the rising sea levels, was there ever just a gigantic flood myth? Because we see the flood myth that's worldwide, and everyone has floods. But here, more than even just say the Mississippi or the Amazon overswelling, here literally by generations almost the earliest peoples could probably say, "Oh, the water keeps getting, we're going to be gone at some point." Was that ever a basis of a myth?
Not that I know of. Not that I know of. In North Alaska, there are some stories of floods, and we actually were looking for a site on a mountaintop there was an umiak that came to rest on a mountaintop in North Alaska, but I'm not aware of any similar stories for the Aleutians or southern Alaska.
Okay. Another pervasive myth in many cultures is that of the wild man. Many cultures have it that certainly in Christian, Judeo-Christian, there's the people who turn away from God. That you have these ideas of Grendel. You have Enkidu from the Middle East, and then more laterally you have people, the ideas of the abominable snowman or Sasquatch or whatnot. Were there ever, you talked about how if people don't act morally, everyone suffers. But if one individual like this fellow in the octopus myth, was there ever any specific retribution towards evil people, that they would become outcasts and become the Grendels or the Sasquatches of the area?
There are actually, what are they, outside man.
Yeah.
And it's not so much in Eskimo cultures, although the Aleuts do have stories of outside man, as the Athabascan cultures. And in those groups, they were often living in very small family units. And one of the big dilemmas in Athabascan culture is maintaining enough social cohesion that you have a functioning society. And outside man is a guy who spends a little too much time alone in the woods and becomes unfit to be around other human beings. So he basically goes feral and goes wild and is not loses his humanity because he's separated himself from people. And they prey on communities. They'll steal women, they'll steal food, they'll kill people who are hunting in the woods. They're basically a boogeyman. But he starts out as a man who has separated himself from human society. Okay. And the Aleuts do have stories of outside men.
Okay,
they live in the hills and come down, and people disappear and are never seen again.
So, Deborah, I want to pick up a little bit on the structure of some of the first and more ancient societies in the Aleutians. So, were these patriarchies, matriarchies? Was it strictly tribal, or did, like some Native American tribes down in the 48, did they have like confederacies?
We're still puzzling that out. What I found as we're putting this book together on the prehistory. I was looking at what we have in the Aleutians are separate island clusters. There's the near islands with Attu, Agatu, and some small islands. The Rat Islands have Kiska and Amchitka and some small islands. The Andrianoff Islands, Adak, Atka, Amlia, some big islands and a bunch of small islands. What we see in the distant past is we're seeing small communities scattered across the whole island. So there'll be a small village in a bay, and then the next bay over has a small village, and people were probably living in family groups, extended family, 30, 40, 50 people, in kind of a self-contained domestic unit, but they would have kin ties with neighboring villages, and then as populations grow, about 1,000 years ago in the Aleutians, what you see is the villages get bigger, and you'll get a large village on an island, or a couple of large villages on an island, and then they have associated smaller communities around them. And the groups were led by an older, wise, experienced male. And there were hierarchies. So wise, experienced male A might be subordinate to experienced male B if there were two families in a village. One would be slightly higher than the other. And by the time the Russians arrived, we had a situation where there were some very, very large villages with powerful chiefs, and they were the head of a kin unit. So he would have all these relatives who were his supporters. And a successful man would attract other men, other families, who would want to live in his village because he was doing really well and they had food, et cetera, et cetera. But those families would also have their head men. So there would be this structure where you have this guy at the top, but you have all these other head guys, and they're ranked in an order. There's some confusion about whether they were matrilineal or patrilineal, and I think the idea is that they were patrilineal, so the descent was reckoned through the father. But Aleuts they practiced what's called brother-sister exchange. So two men would swap sisters. This guy would marry this guy's sister. This guy would marry this guy's sister. So they were brother-in-laws. And in some ways, that makes it the brother-in-law was responsible for training the kids, his sister's kids, to be hunters, et cetera, et cetera. So that looks matrilineal.
Well, let me.
But they did have, so in like the near islands, which I'm more familiar with, there's a top chief on Agatu Island. And the other villages have their chiefs, but this guy is the top dog. On Attu Island, there's one or two guys who are at the top of the heap, but every village has its own leader. So the island can act as a corporate entity because they recognize this guy as the top of the heap. And when the Russians got there, they would further pick another guy who was above all the island chiefs. In the eastern islands, it got even more complicated, and it looks at some point as if there was, at least on some of the islands, a man who could exercise some influence over all the villages on the island and all the chiefs on an island.
So, did they live in longhouses the way Vikings and Scandinavians and a lot of the Iroquois tribes of Ontario, Quebec, and New England did?
Yeah, late prehistory, they moved into these longhouses, which is associated with the increased political complexity. Some of them in the eastern Aleutians were huge. I've seen a couple that were 50 meters long. And the Russians described villages with one house that had a population of 300 to 500 people. So they weren't real wide because roofing, big wide is a problem, but they could be infinitely long. You can just keep extending the trench.
Yeah.
Indefinitely. So yeah, huge houses, and there were some villages that had a half a dozen of these longhouses in them.
So if they originally came probably from, say, the Lake Baikal area, I would assume that these people had spears, they had clubs. Did they also have bows and arrows?
They did. Some did. Bows and arrows are not particularly useful in a kayak. It's hard to hunt with a bow in a kayak, so they used a spear thrower. Bows and arrows were used to hunt people and land animals, and since there aren't any in most of the Aleutians, if they had them in Atka or Adak, it was a war weapon. On the Alaska Peninsula, where they had caribou and bears, they did use bows to hunt caribou and bears, but the bow was primarily a weapon for war.
Okay, because I know Baikal is probably a couple hundred miles north of Outer Mongolia, and the Asian steppes were famous for producing dozens of bow and arrow people that were great horsemen. They didn't bring any horses over.
No.
How about did they ever domesticate the caribou the way the Sami people of Scandinavia have?
No, in the late 1800s, missionaries brought caribou or reindeer to Alaska and introduced reindeer herding. But the native people here never seemed to domesticate them. They just followed them.
How about dogs? Did they have dogs with them when they came?
They did. The Aleuts did not have dogs. No. But most of the native people in Alaska had dogs for hunting, for protection, for someone said that the Dorset people in northern Canada probably couldn't have lived there without dogs because they warn you about polar bears.
Yeah.
So, but the Aleutian people didn't have dogs until kind of late prehistory. A few islands in the east got dogs.
So I want to, before we talk about the Russians and any East Asians that came in post-Columbian times, what have you ever found remains of, say, mass murder? I did the show on war and whether war is innate to human beings. I did actually 2 shows recently, and were there blood feuds between islands, tribes? Were there blood? Have we ever found like mass graves where one group of islanders came and they just wiped out another group of islanders, say 1,000 years ago?
Not so much of that. There is evidence of violence, interpersonal violence, and the one that really stands out is a friend excavated a village on Unangas Island, which is the first island. It's separated from the Alaska Peninsula by a fairly narrow strait, but he was excavating a house that was eroding, and one of the rooms was partially eroded, so he finished excavating that. Had 2 bodies in it, and one of them had a Kodiak-style spear, which was a ground slate spear point, embedded in the back of his neck. So yeah, there is evidence of warfare. Certainly a lot of stories of warfare, and there are a number of arrows. If you find arrow points, and they can be hard to tell from small spear points, but some archaeologists figure out how to do that stuff. But the Aleuts made spear points that were specifically designed for war. And what that meant was they would either have really long, skinny barbs on them, so that when they went in, they couldn't be pulled out. It would be like almost shotgun-like. It would go in, and then the splintery barbs would just embed in the flesh and couldn't be pulled out. And then the really evil ones were spear points that had barbs that went in two directions, so that if it went in, a lot of times if you get a spear, you'll push it through, because you can't pull it out, it'll pull meat. Yeah. You push it through and pull it out. If the barbs go both ways, either way is going to cause terrible damage. Yeah. And we have a number of those found in archaeological sites, as these baroquely barbed spear points.
So were the Nungan people, were they sort of the last of the Asians to cross the land bridge? The land bridge comes, several eons pass, people develop their own myths. Were they the last to cross over?
I think they were there fairly early, actually, and then other people came, followed behind. They weren't the first over the land bridge, but they were maybe in the middle of the pack, and they moved. They kind of followed they actually were clever to follow around south and stick with the maritime resources.
So we talk about pre-Columbian America due to Columbus. Now up there though, who is do we go from prehistory and then the Russians come, or did the Japanese ever come over? Did I know famously the Mongols tried to conquer Japan? Did the Mongols ever try to get that far? Did the people from the Sakhalin Islands, the Ainu, did they ever try to?
We're still trying to parse that out. The Aleuts knew about the Commander Islands. They weren't occupied, but they knew about the Commander Islands. There are people who believe the Aleuts continued to venture west and hit Kamchatka and the Kuril Islands. I think that's definitely possible. They were superb boatmen. And they put a high value on adventure. You know, the young men had to prove that they were men. So, you know, sailing off into the wild blue yonder and coming home with, you know, tales of adventure and maybe trophies were highly valued. There's not much in the way of empirical evidence. There are stories the Aleuts told the Russians of men who showed up on the island with pigtails, you know, the long braid from China. And there is metal, iron in prehistoric sites on Amchitka Island that probably came off Japanese ships that were blown off course and washed up. And the Russians certainly repatriated several Japanese crews they found on some of these islands. So how long that had been going on in the past before the Russians got there, who knows? But
we don't know of any official records, say in China of you know, pre-Mongol, say, of Chinese junks going north.
No. And we haven't found clear evidence of Chinese or Japanese junks over there. We've got, the bits of iron that were in knives and stuff like that. But I suspect there was at least intermittent contacts between Asia and the Aleutians. There certainly were contacts across Bering Strait to to mainland Alaska.
Mhm.
There were actual trade relationships between Siberia and Inupiat traders in the Kotzebue area.
So the Russians then basically are the equivalent of the Spanish Empire coming from the east. Then, so what? How did the Russians do it? Was this were they sent by one of the czars to just keep pushing eastward?
The first one was the Bering expedition. Peter the Great sent Vitus Bering to see if there was a connection between Asia and America, and he made two voyages. The first went north and was inconclusive. So Peter ordered him to try again, and that one they went east. There were two ships. Alexei Chirikov hit the mainland somewhere in southeast Alaska. They, of course, got separated early on. Chirikov washed up in southeast Alaska, sent a boat ashore to scout around and get water. It disappeared. He sent another boat ashore. It disappeared. And at that point, they turned around and came back to Russia. Bering came east and got to somewhere around Yakutat in the northern part of the southeast panhandle. Mm. And then basically they turned around and made their way back, kind of touching islands in the mainland as they came. They got back and they had, his boat washed up in the Commander Islands. Most of them died. The survivors rebuilt the ship and sailed back to Russia. They brought back sea otter furs, which turned out to be immensely valuable. And within 3 years of Bering returning to Russia, private trading companies were sending ships east to hunt the sea otters. Mm-hmm. So the exploration and conquest of the Aleutian Islands was basically in the hands of private trading companies, mm-hmm. with the blessing and authorization of the government. But the government didn't send out exploring expeditions or military expeditions. It was traders.
So was this the typical Europe meets a native culture? I mean, were they trying to wipe out the native culture, or what was the relations between them?
The relations, nobody sends their best people to the frontiers. The people in eastern Siberia were very often criminals or exiles or political prisoners. They were ruthless. They were greedy. And the reason they went east was to get rich on these furs. So that was their primary goal, was to get rich. And they weren't going to put up with anything that would get in their way. They also had 100 years of experience dealing with native people who outnumbered them. Mm. So they were pretty ruthless they didn't try to wipe them out, but they didn't want them to be dangerous. Mm. So what Russian trading companies did was the good ones would land, trade with the local people, and build relationships. Mm. So, this guy's my partner. I give him gifts. He gives me interpreters. They bring food and they let us hunt. The bad ones would take hostages. They would kidnap people's children as guarantees for good behavior. And then, of course, these are men on boats. They're out on voyages for 2 or 3 years. So they would often raid villages and kidnap women for the usual purposes. If the local people fought back or protested, there was bloodshed. And it really depends on the crew. I've been doing a lot of work lately looking at the crews and the ships and the skippers, and it really depends on the skippers. Some of them worked very hard to build relationships with people and gave gifts, and they would go back to the same places year after year and get along fine. And others would show up and mayhem would ensue.
So, was there any slavery up there in the north, or was that just not in the Russian?
Yeah, war captives by the natives. Yeah, war captives.
Or by the Russians to the natives.
Oh yeah. Kidnapping. They kidnap kids to be hostages. They would also train them as interpreters. Women would be captured to be concubines, and they also would collect food, fish, pick berries, that kind of stuff. And the men were often forced to hunt for the Russians. They weren't bought and sold, but they were forced to work for these foreigners who just showed up.
Did the Russians practice the same thing that Americans did and the other Europeans in that? Did they sign a lot of treaties with the Russians and then the Russians broke them? Or?
No treaties. They were more personal relationships. The Russian government actually recognized the sovereignty of native people and ordered the traders to treat them properly, bring them into the benevolent Russian fold under the care of the Tsar. And basically all the Tsar wanted was them to pay taxes. Send fur. But otherwise the Tsar didn't actually care, about their political structures, anything like that, as long as they paid their taxes.
Now, did the Russians convert the natives?
Yes.
Because I see, yeah. I'm looking, and caution alert, I'm looking on the Wikipedia page, and there's mention of a St. Peter the Aleut.
Yeah, I don't know much about St. Peter. The first missionary to the Aleutians was Father Ivan Veniaminov. And he was from Russia and sent to Unalaska Island as a young man. But a lot of Aleut people became priests in the later years of the Russian domination. A lot of the Russians set up schools, educated people. They sent missionaries. The Orthodox Church required missionaries to learn the local languages, unlike a lot of American churches. And they set up schools in teaching literacy in Aleut and in Russian. And, of course, a lot of it was religious instruction.
Was that basically the status quo for a couple of hundred years until the Russians sold Alaska to Seward?
Pretty much, yeah. One of my professors said that Americans are obsessed with race, Russians are obsessed with class. Uh-huh. So after the Aleuts were subdued, after they were no longer a military threat, they were given various statuses, and their rights and privileges depended on these social statuses. They were usually ranked somewhere around like townsmen. So they weren't peasants, and they weren't serfs that were owned. They were free, whatever that meant in Russia. But they were paid for their labor. Even though they had to work for the company, they were paid for their labor. They were provided with health care, education, retirement. And they were citizens of the Russian Empire.
So before I get to that, I'm just looking at, it says something, and this sounds kind of bizarre. It says that in the early 19th century, some Aleutians had gone with some Russians down to Baja California and involved in some kind of a war with natives down there. Is
They
that true?
took Aleut hunters to California to hunt sea otters. Yep. Yeah, and the Russians had a fort at Fort Ross, just north of San Francisco. They traded with the Spaniards there for grain. It was very hard to supply the colony in Alaska with food.
Yeah.
It either had to come from Russia all the way across Siberia and then be sent by ship, or get it from California and send it north. But yeah, the Aleuts were hunting along the California coast all the way south to, as far south as sea otters go. And they, fought and killed California people.
That's one of those things that there was the old cartoon Ripley's Believe It or Not. That just seems a very odd thing. And I'm also seeing there that during World War II, and before we get to that, let's talk about the transfer to American sovereignty. What did the Unangan people lose? Did they lose things in terms of civil rights? Because you said the Tsar basically just wanted taxes. He recognized their sovereignty. Did they lose a lot in that deal?
Oh yeah, they
Did they want the
lost.
Russians back after a few years and said, "The hell with these Americans"?
Actually, a lot of Aleuts moved to the Commander Islands with the change, the change in power, because they were citizens. They did have the civil rights that Russian citizen subjects had, and in the treaty, the Russians tried to protect the rights of Native people, and there were three classes. There were the civilized Native people, and they were supposed to have all the rights and privileges of American citizens, and those included all of them that were Christian and that were incorporated into the Russian economic sphere. Hunters, fishermen, et cetera, and those would have included all the Aleuts, the people from Kodiak, Prince William Sound, a lot of the people who are now called Aleuts. There were the semi-civilized ones, or the semi-dependent, I don't remember what they called them, but they were supposed to be protected in certain ways, and then there were the wild tribes that had not been contacted, had not been incorporated in any way into the Russian sphere, and the Russians basically didn't care what happened. It's like that, not our problem. But when the U.S. moved in, they just became natives. Indians, natives, Eskimos. They had no civil rights. They had no economic rights. The schools were closed down. They lost health care. And the Russian American company had maintained some kind. It wasn't just a commercial thing. The Russian American company extracted wealth through furs and labor, but they also provided services in exchange for those furs and labor. The Alaska Commercial Company and Northern Commercial Company bought furs. and sold goods. They didn't provide any of the social services that had come with the Russian American company, and the schools became monolingual in English. So suddenly, Aleuts who'd been literate in two languages were now illiterate again, and they back to zero. So yeah, they lost an awful lot, and then the U.S. also made a greater effort to control the social life and the political lives of Native people. The Russians, like I said, the Russians didn't care how the villages were run as long as the labor and the furs kept coming.
So, did the gold rush that hit the Yukon in the late 19th century? I know that affected, a lot of the people went from California up to Alaska, then over to Europe. Did that in any way affect the Aleutian end of the state? The people there, were there subsequent rushes for goods their way in the end of the 19th century?
The village Dutch Harbor, Unalaska and Dutch Harbor, was a major shipping point for supplying the gold fields. So lots of ships came through. It was also a major shipping point for the whaling fleets that came through. So there was a lot of influences coming through Dutch Harbor in the early years. Most of the rest of the islands were not affected so much. The ships weren't as interested in. There weren't the amenities at any of the other islands as there was at Dutch. So there was a lot of traffic through Dutch Harbor. In the early 20th century, fox farming became a huge economic engine in the Aleutians, and the islands were leased by the government to fox trappers, who basically they planted foxes on the island, then they would come back in a few years and then trap the foxes. So most of the islands were people say they were bought. This guy owned this island, this guy owned this island, but they were leases. Most of the islands were owned by white guys from somewhere else, who they would pay Aleuts to trap for them. Some of the islands, there was a guy in Alaska that made an effort to get several villages their own trapping islands, and those villages would manage their own trapping islands and trap for themselves. And actually, they at that point, Aleuts were quite wealthy from the earnings from trapping fox furs up until 1929. They heard people talk about walking around with pockets full of $100 bills. Just the end of the trapping season, you'd come in, sell your furs, and then you just have wads, literally fistfuls of cash.
So that sort of brings us to the 20th century, Deborah. One of the things I find interesting, everyone nowadays knows about the internment of Japanese Americans during the Second World War. But I'm looking and I'm surprised to hear that a lot of the Aleut peoples were interned in Alaska after the Japanese took over. Was it Attu and Kiska Islands? And I know I found that a few years ago I saw a documentary on that. I actually wrote a novel where I have a segment based on the war on Attu Island, and I think Kiska then the Japanese abandoned. But why were the native peoples interred? Because they would. Not that I'm justifying it, but in a bizarre way, you could say, well, the Japanese, maybe the Japanese Americans have people over in Japan who they might be loyal to, and they could be traitors. Not that I'm rationalizing it, but how could they rationalize interning Native Americans?
It was a protective measure. They were afraid, the authorities were afraid that if the Japanese took over the Aleutians, the Aleuts would be caught up in the war. So it was actually a humanitarian effort to get civilians out of a potential war zone. The execution was appallingly bad, and it ended up being essentially an internment. They were the different communities were taken to different areas in Southeast Alaska, and put in. I think one was a cannery, one was an old CCC camp. Canneries were designed to be used in the summer. They were not designed for winter occupation, so uninsulated, no running water. And essentially, after they were moved off the islands, they were abandoned in the camps where they were deposited. So they weren't, and they were only allowed to take like a suitcase. So they didn't have the belongings or the equipment and tools they would need to take care of themselves in these camps. Their Atka village was burned to keep the Japanese from using the buildings. So the U.S. military burned the village, except they didn't burn the 3 houses in town that had plumbing in them. They kept those. It's a really painful episode in Aleut history. It was a humanitarian effort that was botched because of racism and indifference. So they put them in these fairly remote areas in Southeast Alaska and left them to their own devices. And a lot of them were the local people down there brought food, and at some point Aleut men started leaving the camps to get work in the local communities to support their families. But the death rates were appalling. The mortality rates for those internment camps, I think, reached 30%. They lost old people, they lost babies. A lot of the corporate memory of the communities and a lot of the wisdom of the elders disappeared when they died. It was a huge, and then a lot of them didn't come back after the war. Younger people went off, had gotten jobs and moved to other areas, and they never went back to their islands. So there was families disrupted, social systems completely shredded, and then when they went back home, their Atka, their houses had been burned. They had to rebuild from scratch. In Dutch Harbor and some of the other communities, their houses had been looted and used by soldiers during the war. Their belongings were gone. Everything was basically out of shell of a house. They all had to start over from scratch. So yeah, it was a black eye in American history.
You said that they were moved for humanitarian purposes. Did any serve in the military?
Yes. Mm-hmm. So a lot of them did. Young men left to get out of the camps. They also recruited young Aleut males to be scouts in the Aleutians, for the counter-offensive against the Japanese, because they had the local knowledge.
Yeah. Did they ever do anything like the Navajo code breakers or anything? Use any parts of their culture? No.
No. It was mostly leading troops through the mountains and valleys.
So after the war, did things improve? I know you have. Have any Aleuts served as state senators or representatives? Are there any well-known politicians who champion for the cause, either natives or white Americans white Alaskans rather, that are big on that?
A lot of them were very active in land claims legislation, very active in trying to get native claims recognized and acknowledged by the government, and trying to get the land transferred to the people. Lot of religious leaders, educators, things like that. I'm not, well, the few have been politicians. A lot of some business leaders, fishermen. They corporation executives now. They've running their corporation, the Aleut Corporation. Not really on the statewide. I know of one. Carl Moses was a state legislator, and he's an Aleut businessman from Unalaska.
Yeah. So, how about in terms of civil rights movements? I mean, in the lower 48, of course, we had figures like Martin Luther King and Malcolm X and a number of others that are well known for African Americans. You had the American Indian movement back in the 60s and 70s. Has there ever been any movement similar for the Aleut peoples in general, or have there ever been like a secessionist movement that they want to form their own, quasi state?
No. The Aleut League was formed for land rights and civil rights, and the Alaska Federation of Natives is the big kind of blanket organization that advocates for Native rights and social services and stuff for Alaska. But no, they're pretty staunch patriots, Americans.
So there isn't anything like I mean, I would assume that there's some level of resentment towards, let's call it, white culture, but it doesn't express itself in the sense of, like, there might be people who would call, I won't use the real word, but a lot of black people would call people Uncle Toms or house Negroes. Is there any resentment for people who are too close to the dominant culture?
No, not really. There is an undercurrent of suspicion and wariness. They like I said at the very beginning, they're cautious about talking to reporters, authors, things like that, because they've been represented badly in the past, and things that I've heard examples that to me sounded very benign that turned out to have been very painful. One man said his father had been injured in a hunting accident and was lame, so he was not as capable a hunter as men who weren't lame. And a white guy who'd been a teacher on one of the islands wrote a book called Birthplace of the Winds, and he mentions this man's father and said the family was poor because this guy was lame. Well, Dan, the man who was telling me this, said it wasn't Dad's fault. He was injured in a hunting accident, and it was very hurtful to have this guy say we were poor because Dad was lame. So they're very, very proud of their history and their past and who they are. They're very proud of that, and they're sometimes what might be considered militant in expressing this pride in who they are. But it's not an anger at the society that has inflicted these emotional wounds. I'm constantly amazed that Native people will let us. I've done archaeology in the Aleutians since 1983. We have never, ever had any problem getting permission or buy-in from the Aleut community to do the work that we've asked to do out there. In the early 2000s, a team from Kansas wanted to do DNA studies. Mm-hmm. And they went through the communities, they talked to people, they met with leaders, and after expressing their reservations and concerns about how this material would be used, they opened their arms and let these guys take DNA samples and, publish them in scholarly articles. And they wanted to know how it was going to be used. They wanted to make sure that it wasn't going to make them look bad. But they wanted to know the information. So I have been constantly amazed at how open most Alaska Natives, and certainly the Aleuts, have been to having white guy outsiders show up and say, we want to study your ancestors.
Yeah. So
it's been extraordinary.
There was nothing like the Kennewick Man stuff in Washington where, there was the battle between scientists versus the grave stuff, no?
No. When I worked at Fish and Wildlife Service, I did repatriation. I was bringing back ancestors who'd been taken in the past and getting them back to the communities for reburial. And I heard anger and frustration with that. Why were they allowed to take these people, from their homes? Why were they allowed to put them in museums? But there was this thank you for bringing them back to us. Thank you for working to get them brought back home. I can't explain it. I doubt they could explain it, but the generosity and forgiveness has been astounding to me.
So what is the current status of especially younger people with the main monoculture of America? Do they listen to rap music? Do they watch television? Do they know who Lady Gaga or Brad Pitt is, kind of thing?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. All of that. Everybody's got an iPhone. Uh-huh. All the things that we're horrified that our kids do. It's like, yeah, no, they're fully embedded in the total American pop culture. Totally. There's concern that I guess there's a big question. What does it mean to be Aleut today?
Yeah.
What does it mean to be an Aleut in the modern world? Yeah. And I think that's something that they're all kind of thinking about, working on. They're not sea mammal hunters anymore. They're fishermen, but They don't go out and spear seals. They don't wear fur clothes. What does it mean to be an Aleut in the modern world?
Yeah. So are they outliers within the community of Alaskan Natives, or are they representative? Are Inuits also, young Inuits, still into cell phones and YouTube and all that?
Oh, yeah. No, I've lost you here.
Oh, can you do that? Okay.
My email came up and blotted out my screen. No, Alaskan Native kids are fully embedded in modern culture, which doesn't serve them well in their villages. Yeah. It's like you look around at your relative, your parents are hopelessly out of date, that kind of stuff. So they come to the cities.
Yeah.
To participate in modern life, and the villages are losing population. The kids are
I was going to ask
separate.
that next.
Sure.
Is because like here I live in Texas, and if you go out to the desert parts of Texas, it's nothing but senior citizens and maybe a few babies.
Yeah,
The
yep.
teenagers to 50 are all gone.
Yeah, they move into town to
Yeah.
get jobs, to go to school, to participate in, the excitement of city life, and then yeah, there are several communities that are teetering on the brink of extinction because all that's left are the senior citizens and maybe one family with some kids, and family might start out there with, you've got two or three kids, but as soon as they start getting into school, you want them to be in a better school than the village can provide. And if you want a paying job, they're few and far between in the, especially a really small community. You've got to come to Anchorage or Fairbanks or one of the other cities. Even the fishing, um, you can fish from Atka, say it's a tiny little town, but then where do you sell your fish? Where do you take them?
Hmm.
So they move to like Kodiak or Unalaska because that's where the processors are and that's where the fleets are.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's a real brain drain from rural communities.
Yeah. Is there a state government plan for the future of the Aleut peoples, especially with global warming, to preserve those ways, or is it directed from the people themselves? And is there make any headway?
The state doesn't. The state doesn't seem to be aware. Um, uh, there are a number of villages in Alaska that are in the process of moving because of erosion and flooding. It's an enormously expensive proposition to move a village. All the houses, you've got to basically you're picking a place on the landscape where there's nothing, and then you're putting in a modern community. The schools, runway, water, sewer, power, everything. But this is just the beginning. The Yukon Delta is about this far above sea level. It's like southern Louisiana.
Yeah.
It's as far above sea level, and as sea level rise, you get these storm surges across. A lot of villages are probably going to just pretty much go away in the next 50 years because the land they're sitting on no longer exists.
So, what is the future of, do you think, of the whole Unangan people in general as a culture? And what are you personally, what's your next book or your next study going to be?
They're Alaskan Native people in general and Unangan. They're gonna continue. They're tough. They're resilient. They love living in their homeland. Most Unangan people actually live out of the islands.
Yeah.
We joke about Anchorage being the largest native village in Alaska. That's where the jobs are. But people who live in Atka and Unalaska and in the Pribilofs, they want to live there. They want these communities to work. They want that connection to their past and their traditions, whatever their traditions are evolving into in the modern world. I am confident we may lose a number of villages, but there will always be some villages. There will always be villages with Unangan people, Yupik people, and Aleutian people, Inupiat people in rural Alaska. It's not an easy place to live. It's not getting any easier to live there, but there are solid values and intangible benefits for the people living there. So I think they'll persist and endure, and there are active heritage programs going on to maintain and teach language, foodways, history. They're supportive of the research people have been doing in their history and culture, and they actively incorporate things that we learn and tell them about into their heritage efforts. So they'll be around. They'll be
So,
around.
again, though, what is the next book that you're working on? And is there any particular one mystery or thing that, if in your lifetime you'd like to know about the history of the Nungan people that isn't known now? What would that be?
Well, right now we're finishing up. My partner Diane Hansen and I are finishing up our book on the archaeology and prehistory of the Aleutian Islands, hoping to get that done by December, January this year. I'm currently working on two projects. One is looking at the Russian contact period from 1742 to 1800, and that contact, the effects on the people and the environment, looking at a kind of a colonialist analysis of the extraction of wealth from an area back to Europe, that kind of thing, which is fascinating. Right now, I'm looking at. There was a war in the Eastern Aleutians, but I'm not sure war is the right term. There were 4 ships that were in the Eastern Aleutians at the same time, and the Aleuts were tired of these knuckleheads inflicting themselves on their communities, and they basically obliterated these 4 ships and the crews. Over 200 Russians killed, and 4 ships burned and destroyed, and that kind of altered relationships. It kind of altered the way the Russians dealt with the Unangan after that. And then the other thing I'm really interested in is the religious experience, the mythology, and the call it philosophy, the basic life philosophy of the Unangan Aleut. Years ago, a young man said, "Nobody ever talks about our religion. I'd like to know about our religion." And so I started looking at the folklore, the available folklore, and didn't make any sense to me. It was recorded in the early 1900s. The people who recorded these stories basically just told the stories to the anthropologists collecting them, and they're full of cultural assumptions that any Aleut listening to the story at the time would have understood immediately what these were about. 120 years later, they're very difficult to understand. And I got the idea that maybe if I looked at a broader picture of Eskimo Aleut religion, these stories might become more clear and make more sense. And it's been an extraordinary journey. Some of them are like the sea otter, the sister brother turning into the sea otter, and now they're the sun and the moon, and she, the woman who's the sun, is also the spirit of the volcano and fire and life and a destructive force and a creative force. And I'm thinking of maybe something to do with this female deity, Aleut female god, and her power. She seems to be very important in the stories, but also just a broader kind of survey of the religious concepts.
Well, I'd like to see the book when you're done with it. Please send me a PDF or what when if it's done. We could do a follow-up show in a year or so. But I want to thank you for spending a couple of hours, a little more than a couple of hours, talking about all of this. It was very interesting and informative. I will link. You still have this. What is it? The Aleutian Island Working Group. I can link to that.
Yeah, link to the that web page. It's slowed down quite a bit, but yeah, it still exists.
Yeah, so I'll link to that, and it was great talking to you, and thank you once again.
Oh, you're very welcome. Thanks for your persistence, and good luck with. Just one final parting word is I suspect every Native American group has a history and a culture that's every bit as fascinating as what I've learned from the Unangan
Yeah.
people. So I'm hoping you can snag or find someone out there to tell us more about some of these other groups.
Well, hopefully, if they watch this, I'll send them the link to this when I contact them. Hopefully, they'll see that I'm not up to something nefarious, and hopefully, it'll get easier after I get a handful of these under my belt. So, thank you
Yeah.
again.
Yeah.
Okay,
Oh, you're very welcome, and good luck with this.